I very, very rarely buy games on release. For most of my time as a gamer, I've considered myself one of those irritating tightwads who picks up games a few years down the line on sale with all the DLC. A game has to be pretty special for me to pick it up on day one, and it says something about how much I value Darkest Dungeon that its sequel was one of those select few. The original is one of my go-to comfort games, as weird as that descriptor might be when applied to a bleak game about battling nightmarish horrors and the ensuing psychological breakdowns. Something about the tense but rewarding gameplay and amazing presentation instantly enraptured me when I first played it way back in 2016, and I've come back to it on multiple platforms since then. When the sequel was announced, I was naturally intrigued, but I never play early access games, so I've had to wait until its official launch to get my hands on it, and now that I finally have, well, I have mixed feelings. Truth be told, even after playing well over 100 hours of Darkest Dungeon 2, I don't feel like I've formed a solid opinion even as I sit here and write this piece. A big part of that is how special the first game is to me, I suppose, so a successor was always going to be pretty emotionally loaded with expectations. Honestly, part of why I'm writing this is to try and get my disparate thoughts in order to finally come to a definitive conclusion and move on with other things. With that goal in mind, let's get the basic stuff out of the way. Disclaimer: despite having spent a great deal of time with the original, I don't consider myself particularly good at it beyond the basic mechanics. I've never been one of those folks who can assemble unkillable super teams or wipe out bosses with a single perfectly min-maxed party member. My interest in Darkest Dungeon has always been more casual, and I'm fine with that, but I just thought I'd throw this aside out there because I know what this game's community can be like, and some people might sneer at my take on some of the gameplay systems and the relative difficulty thereof. Set sometime after the events of the original, Darkest Dungeon 2 sees a vaguely defined apocalypse sweeping the vaguely defined world, in which you play a vaguely defined entity handed a vaguely defined spark of hope by your mentor and are told to carry it to a mysterious mountain in the hope of averting the end of the world. To do this, you recruit 4 mercenaries to accompany you as you fight through various hazards and horrors on the way to your goal. If you're a fan of the original and you're coming in blind as I was, you might be in for a bit of a shock if you're expecting a retread of the first game. The basic gameplay is still the same, a turn-based dark fantasy permadeath RPG with a 4-rank positioning system, and Wayne June's authoritative baritone is still belting out Purple Pro's color commentary as you play, but everything else has seen a significant overhaul. I didn't follow the game's prolonged early access phase, wanting to know as little as possible, but even just from playing the finished product, it was easy to discern Darkest Dungeon 2's primary design goals. First, double down on the roguelike aspect at the expense of the management mechanics, and second, identify all the crutch mechanics players used in the first game and take a sledgehammer to them. To that end, the entire estate management portion of the first game has been completely excised. There's no home base to be built up. You're on the road for the entirety of the game. You also don't have a full roster of heroes XCOM style. Instead, you pick 4 heroes at the start of the expedition, and barring a few special circumstances, that's your lot for the entire run. In a nutshell, there's 5 confessions, effectively story chapters, that you have to beat, though each one is so heavily randomized that the only thing that the confession affects are the final boss, length, and a few gameplay modifiers. For each chapter, you'll have to trek through 2 to 5 randomly generated regions chosen from 5 different regions that contain their own assortment of enemies and hazards. The closest reference point that I can think of for Darkest Dungeon 2's navigation is FTL. Each region has a maze of intersecting, zigzagging paths with a series of hazards and locations strung along them that feature a range of different encounters, including combat, merchants, desperate civilians, and more. Each region will also have a fixed lair boss, and in all story chapters bar the first, you'll have to take out at least one of them on the way in order to eventually be able to have a shot at the endgame boss. Incidentally, if you find yourself on the penultimate region without having faced a lair boss, remember to plan your route from the get-go with the boss fight in mind, lest you do as I once did and assume that the boss fight is going to be near the end of the region and lock yourself out of winning the run at the first fork in the road. Between regions, you'll stay at an inn, which is where most of the recovery mechanics from the hamlet have been relocated. Inns give you the chance to rest and buff your heroes, repair and equip your stagecoach, and stock up on supplies. Inns will also let you replace dead heroes, but since there's an unavoidable tough climactic fight before every single inn, losing a hero might as well be a game over unless you're just on the edge of finishing the region, at least in my experience. Finally, progressing through a run gives you Candles of Hope, which are a meta currency that can be spent in between runs to unlock new items, cosmetics, and upgrades for your heroes that are added to the pool for all future runs as part of the overarching progression system that's standard for all modern roguelikes. If that sounds complicated for a basic gameplay summary, well, it is, and even then I'm only scratching the surface. Darkest Dungeon 2 has a bewildering list of objectives, sub-objectives, resources, modifiers, modifiers and conditions applying to just the navigation layer, let alone the actual combat portion. It can honestly be a little overwhelming at first, but once you start to get the hang of the game's various systems and the risk-reward factor, it starts feeling more natural, and planning your route to balance the various needs to keep yourself alive becomes second nature. The actual combat portion of the game will be much more familiar to Darkest Dungeon vets, though still with several major changes. Like the first game, there's a 4-rank system where some heroes are designed to work in some ranks better than others, and you and the enemy team will politely take turns wailing on each other or supporting your team with carefully selected actions. While the core gameplay is similar, Darkest Dungeon 2's combat has been given a massive facelift, graduating from largely static 2D sprites to fully animated 3D models. It looks pretty good. Red Hook made an effort to retain the signature heavy shadows of the original art style while also adding some surprisingly elaborate animations to make things feel a bit more alive. The attack animations themselves are thankfully brief and don't drag the gameplay down much, if at all. One change I did really appreciate was the inclusion of a turn tracker to make planning your moves less obtuse, unlike the first game where you basically needed to manually keep a flowchart if you wanted to see the turn order. Those are just cosmetic and quality of life upgrades though. The actual meat of the combat system has been altered a lot too. First off, heroes have had their list of equipable skills expanded to a choice of 5 out of 11 possible options, so each class has a touch more flexibility in terms of what they can do in battle. Good thing too, because runs in Darkest Dungeon 2 are much longer than the expeditions in the first game, and you're going to need that extra ability slot to deal with the more varied threats, as well as to just keep things fresh, since you're going to be spending upwards of 3 to 4 hours with the same party. Consumable items have had a big shakeup too. Rather than applying them directly from the inventory, each hero has a dedicated consumable slot that they can use on their turns as effectively a free action. The items themselves have been massively expanded too. Rather than the handful of buffs and curatives the first game had, Darkest Dungeon 2's consumable roster includes a massive variety of buffs, healing items, debuffs, and even direct damage dealers, some of which are powerful enough to turn the tide in a fight on their own, on top of effectively doubling your hero's action economy when they use them. Healing items in particular are really potent, and stockpiling some over the course of the run to savor the final boss can make a big difference. Judicious item use is a much more pronounced part of Darkest Dungeon 2's metagame than it was in the first installment. The other big change to the combat is the new token system. Stats like dodge and protection have been removed, as have most buff and debuff effects. In their place, we have a standardized system of tokens signifying various effects, be they positive or negative. For example, a block token means that the next hit a unit takes will do 50% less damage, while a blind token means that that unit's next attack has a 50% chance of missing. Tokens are used up as they're triggered and can be removed, renewed, or bypassed by various effects. In a nutshell, buffs add positive tokens to friendly units, and debuffs add negative tokens to enemy units rather than unit-specific effects that you have to mouse over to see. There's a lot of tokens too. The game actually has a dedicated button just for bringing up a token glossary, and you will need it early on. The intention here was to make combat conditions more readable at a glance, and I guess it functions well enough in that regard, even though it can get a bit comical in some fights where you have like 10 different tokens on the same unit. I don't know though, I kinda preferred having stats like protection and dodge being inherent characteristics. It made the units feel like they were more distinct. As I alluded to in the opening, combat has also been massively rebalanced with the clear intention of removing the crutch mechanics that were popular in the original. Stun, a ubiquitous status effect in Darkest Dungeon 1, has been damn near excised from the roster. Now only a handful of moves can inflict it, and only with another move of setup, so it's hardly worth thinking about. Healing, both HP and stress, has likewise had a visit from the nerf fairy. Most healing skills are either A, saddled with specific situational requirements, or B, limited to healing targets at low HP, often with limited uses or cooldown timers to boot, so there's no keeping your party topped off at all times. The saving grace here is that unlike the first game, you get a gradual passive heal as you travel between combat encounters, so there's not as much pressure to rely on battle heals to keep your team going, and consumable healing items can pick up some of the slack too. The token system has also crippled some of the old strategies. Mark, rebranded as Combo, now only procs on the next move to activate it rather than effectively giving turns of free damage. Buffs likewise only apply as many times as there are tokens, and most now only affect a single target, so you have to be a lot more selective when applying them. By the same token, having heroes with skills that can eliminate or bypass enemy defenses is a lot more important now. There's been a few other changes worth noting. Corpses have been integrated deeper into the gameplay as a mechanic. There are more moves on the hero roster for removing them, and some enemies can consume their fallen allies for a power buff, incentivizing the player to take them out. Enemy variety has also been enhanced within a region, so you're not fighting the same 6 units over and over. Plus, you'll know what you're going to be fighting based on which of the 5 different kinds of combat encounter you're entering. Burn damage over time has been added implement along Blight and Bleed, although only one class makes use of it to any notable degree. Some classes have been reworked a bit. The Vestal and Occultist now have a sort of mana system where they gradually accumulate special tokens to fuel their spells. The Leper is constantly generating blinded tokens you have to play around with support from other heroes, and the Plague Doctor is actually a viable healer now, which I'm really happy about. Finally, the Death's Door mechanic also now applies to bosses and tougher enemies as well, which definitely took some getting used to. I think on the whole most of these changes are for the better. The first game often felt like it was too easy to establish a winning formula, and Darkest Dungeon 2's combat feels more flexible and active by comparison. The fact that you'll be needing to adapt to a greater variety of threats helps too. There are no less than 9 different enemy factions, not including bosses, so you'll need to change up your tactics rather than cruise by fighting the same enemies like you did in the first game Expeditions. Some of the nerfs to healing and stun may have been a bit overzealous as someone who's always played on a more casual level, but overall, it's a smooth and intuitive combat system once you get past an admittedly steep learning curve. While the combat itself is stronger, I unfortunately do think that Darkest Dungeon 2 is also a step backwards in several ways, mainly regarding heroes and the management systems around them. My first bugbear is simply the number of heroes. At 12 total, Darkest Dungeon 2 has fewer playable heroes than the original base game, not even counting the DLC, and that's being generous because I'm counting the Bounty Hunter, who's been demoted to a situational temporary party member that you can only get for a single region per run. I might have been willing to overlook this if it had been a whole new cast, but the thing is, there's a grand total of 1 new character in the entire roster, the Runaway. Again, I'd been doing my best to avoid knowing anything going in, so I was genuinely kind of shocked when I saw the hero selection screen. In all fairness, Darkest Dungeon 2 also put some effort into making heroes more versatile to make up for the smaller roster. While in the first game you could kind of try to tinker with the class's mechanics with skill selection and trinkets, 2 has expanded on this with the introduction of a full-blown subclass system. All characters have 5 unlockable paths that alter the way some of their skills and attributes behave to build towards a certain playstyle, like the Plague Doctor's Surgeon path buffing melee damage and healing at the expense of her blight attacks. It's a neat feature, but I don't think it entirely makes up for the diminished headcount. For one thing, I think there's some pretty severe balance issues between subclasses. The Surgeon subclass mentioned above is crazy powerful compared to the default Plague Doctor, for instance, while others feel gimmicky or downright underpowered. Probably the most prominent example is the Runaway Survivalist subclass, which buffs the healing abilities of a class with one extremely situational healing skill. As a consequence, I don't think it really works as well as just having more characters to choose from. This is going to come off as fanboy bitching, and to an extent I suppose it is, but having spent so much time playing the original, I really found myself missing some of the cut characters. In particular, I think ditching the Arbalest was a big mistake. Without her, there isn't really a dedicated heavy hitter for the back ranks. Sure, you could try and spec out the Highwayman as a ranged fighter, but it's not quite the same thing as having a whole class dedicated to that role. I also think the Bounty Hunter's whole guest party member thing is kind of pointless. It just seems like a gimmick for the sake of having a gimmick. I'm sure this didn't bother some people, but the idea of the sequel having fewer characters in it just bugs me on principle, even if I can understand the reasoning behind it. My second issue is the new hero management system. This is always Darkest Dungeon's signature mechanic, with the quirks, afflictions, diseases, and of course the stress system all combining to make your party feel more alive and organic than other dungeon crawlers tend to. Red Hook has made an effort to significantly overhaul the system while remaining true to the core identity of the original, and again, while I get what they were trying, I can't help but feel that it's inferior to what we had before. The stress system, while still in play, has been significantly streamlined and feels less relevant than before. Stress points now simply accumulate from 1 to 10 with a resolve test when you max it out. The affliction system is gone, replaced with meltdown. Instead of gaining a persistent negative modifier, they'll just take a large amount of damage and lose relationship points with the rest of the party, vice versa for virtues, which are now just called resolute. As far as I can tell, stress cannot directly kill heroes in this game, and while it's certainly not good, maxing out on stress and suffering a meltdown is much less of a calamity than afflictions were in the original. Afflictions have been replaced with the new relationship system. Basically, your party members all have an affinity meter with each other from 1 to 20, starting at 9. Most gameplay activities have a chance to either increase or decrease the affinity value between two heroes. Sometimes the player is given a notification of this before taking an action so they can factor it into their decision making, but more often it's just random. High stress also impacts affinity, so relieving stress only makes it more likely for things to improve rather than affecting it directly, so all you can really do is try to keep stress low and hope for the best. The player can only really control affinity at ins with the use of in items, but even if the randomly generated in stockpile has the right item, in most cases you'll need to apply it multiple times to make a meaningful change, and even then a lot of them have the chance to lower affinity instead of improve it. So if there's more than one bad relationship in your party, trying to fix things can take quite a while. This isn't helped by the fact that the affinity interface is kinda clunky and hard to navigate. Applying in items in general feels like it takes longer than it should. The end result of this is a system the player doesn't have a great deal of control over, but has a lot of potential gameplay impact. Characters can form either positive or negative relationships, with the odds determined by affinity, and relationships matter a lot. They're the most direct analog to the Affliction system from Darkest Dungeon 1, in that there are multiple different types of relationships that have different in-game effects. Characters with positive relationships will, among other things, give free stress heals, guard each other from attacks, and might even follow up their partner's attack with a free hit of their own, which is always fun. Conversely, heroes with negative relationships will insult each other to cause stress, apply debuff tokens, attack each other, and so on. Since negative relationships both create and are made more likely by stress, having one form can create a vicious cycle that can very quickly ruin an entire run. There's also the bless/curse skill mechanic, which I'm really not a fan of. When two characters form a relationship, one of each of their skills is selected at random to be blessed, in the case of a positive relationship, or cursed for a negative relationship. When a hero uses a blessed skill, it will give their partner a small boon, like a heal, a stress heal, or a buff, and vice versa for cursed skills. The problem is the skill is chosen at random from all your hero's skills, not just the ones equipped, so if it gets applied to a skill that doesn't gel with the subclass you're running, tough luck. With blessed skills, you can at least ignore this if you like, but if a curse gets applied to a skill you don't have equipped, the game forces you to equip it at the expense of one of your other skills and won't let you unequip it. Relationships are reset at the end of each region and can't be changed manually, so if a bad relationship forms, there's a good chance at least one of your heroes is going to be stuck with a skill you didn't want, possibly at the expense of a skill you put an upgrade point into. At the extreme end of things, this can wind up saddling you with a skill you straight up cannot use with the current build you have for that hero. I really don't like this mechanic. I get it's supposed to be a punishment for allowing relationships to deteriorate, but it just feels like a forced and inorganic conclusion that goes against the core gameplay. I'd honestly have been fine with the whole blessed curse thing being scrapped. The character's spontaneous in-game actions feel like reward and punishment enough, but if we have to have it, I think it should at least be limited to the skills you currently have equipped for that hero. As amusing as it might be to watch another hero form an amorous relationship with the leper, I think it probably would have been better just stick with the Affliction system. Relationships seem like an arbitrary and convoluted way to arrive at the same basic mechanic, and the system feels too open to random chance for something with that much of a gameplay impact. I've had a number of runs get tanked by a poorly chosen cursed skill, and when that happened I couldn't help but feel like the game had screwed me, and that's never a good feeling to walk away from a session with. The change of format to a sort of grimdark road trip is also something I have mixed feelings about. I can appreciate Red Hook wanting to change up the format, but I'm not convinced it was the right call. A big part of the XCOM permadeath party tradition is getting attached to your characters and building them up over time. Darkest Dungeon 2 still has stuff like the randomized positive and negative quirks for every hero, but they're reset every run as part of the roguelike design philosophy. Hero progression has also been gutted. Each skill can only be upgraded once, upgrade points themselves are scarce, and the hero XP and equipment upgrades being axed just leaves equipable trinkets as your only way to upgrade your guys. Altogether, Darkest Dungeon 2 creates a system where heroes feel temporary and disposable rather than long-term investments. It's not quite true, actually. If you do manage to beat the end boss, you can save some of your heroes from that party for future use. There's even a whole mechanic where you can spend candles to give lasting upgrades to individual heroes, but that only extends to some very minor persistent buffs, and skill upgrades and trinkets are not carried over between runs, so having a veteran hero on hand is not necessarily the advantage it might sound like. It's especially easy to lose veteran heroes because, since the overarching estate portion of the game is gone, you can no longer back out of expeditions or even combats. If you abandon an expedition, you lose everything but your candles of hope. Heroes, inventory, etc. are all gone. Combined with the RNG-based nature of combat, it's very possible for a few bad rolls to scuttle an entire run. This was also very true in the original game. Hell, it was practically part of its core identity, but you could pull your heroes and inventory out to fight another day. In Darkest Dungeon 2, a failed run wipes the slate completely, and while it's true that a lot of the game has been rebalanced with that in mind, I'm not convinced it was the best course of action. Compounding this issue is the game's structure. Darkest Dungeon 1 took the XCOM formula of having a lot of lower stakes missions with variable objectives punctuated by climactic boss fights. In Darkest Dungeon 2, you're guaranteed to have to fight at least 2 bosses every single go, the lair boss and the endgame confession boss, the latter of which are brutally difficult and often take some time to figure out. Looking at you, Obsession, every single run having a showdown with a final boss kind of makes me less inclined to experiment with new hero builds, and if your party's in rough shape at the final region, then you may as well call it quits right there. I'm sure some would argue it's about the journey, not the destination, and that the first game got too easy at times, but I feel like Darkest Dungeon 2's campaigns are too long and too random to be able to support this level of difficulty. Since this game clearly has aspirations to imitate other roguelikes, I'd point out that most have runs that clock in between half an hour to an hour at most, while the later stages of Darkest Dungeon 2's Confessions can easily hit 4. That's a lot of time and commitment to have thrown in the bin because you had an unexpected encounter with a roaming boss or just a few bad dice rolls. Case in point, one attempt to take out the very final boss flamed out because my Plague Doctor randomly picked up the Pyromaniac trait and decided it was more important to chuck a Molotov at the enemy rather than heal my mortally wounded Hellion, who, sure enough, died immediately after, scuttling the fight. This wasn't bad play on my part, it was a series of dice rolls I had no actual say over, and while that might be acceptable in a 30-minute or so session that's part of a larger campaign, in this case it meant 3+ hours of work went in the bin and I had to take it from the top. Again, this shit happened all the time in the first game, but in my view, you can't just port that same system over to a radically different format and expect it to have the same impact. But all that pales in comparison to one of the biggest design oversights I've seen in a boss fight. Fair warning, I'm going to have to spoil the final boss here, so on the off chance anyone is watching this and wants to be unspoiled, skip forward about a minute or so. Alright, so the final boss has a mechanic where it will summon specters tailored to each individual hero's past, and defeating them will allow you to take a massive chunk out of the otherwise impossibly large health pool. It's a neat concept, but the problem is specters can only be damaged by their corresponding hero. I like that as a narrative gameplay conceit, but in practice, it's a mechanic that can soft lock your entire run. Take a look at this. I was having a go at the final boss and summoned the Runaway Spectre, only to find out that it spawns in rank 4 and my Runaway was kitted out as a front row fighter, meaning she had no moves that could hit rank 4 and I literally could not damage the Spectre in any way. Effectively, I had unwittingly both locked myself out of being able to use the primary way to progress through the fight and also spawned in a completely invincible unit that got 2 free, highly damaging attacks per turn, effectively soft locking the run and throwing hours of work into the bin because I wasn't clairvoyant enough to realize the game would spawn an enemy where I couldn't reach it. I'm sure some people will say it was my fault, but as far as I'm concerned, that's just astonishingly bad design to have a cheap shot like that in a game with no way of mitigating it. I'm sorry, but you don't get to cry trial and error when it takes around the runtime of Oppenheimer just to get a single crack at the boss. To put it more simply, Darkest Dungeon 2 feels like a framework built around an XCOM-style overarching campaign bolted onto a pure roguelike, and I'm not convinced that combination works. There's just too much RNG for a long-form format like this. Having to roll with the punches was always a core part of the experience, as the opening title card states outright, but getting screwed over by the dice 3 hours in and having to start from scratch is a step beyond that, in my opinion. I understand and even admire Red Hook's desire to move forward and experiment with a new format, but ultimately I think keeping some version of the management campaign would have been a better decision. Basically, I'd rather have seen it improved on rather than scrapped entirely. After that lengthy dive into mechanics, I'd like to zoom out a bit and discuss the narrative stuff. Darkest Dungeon to me will probably always be the ultimate example of what stellar presentation can do for a game. Despite my affinity for Darkest Dungeon, I've never been particularly into turn-based combat or that sort of number-grindy, stat-focused gameplay, but slap that art style, wonderfully horrible monsters, enchanting narration, and bleak Lovecraftian tone on top, and suddenly I'm all over it. The sequel makes a lot of effort to replicate that magic. While the characters and landscapes have shifted to 3D, they feel in keeping with the original art style, and there's still a fair amount of that signature hand-drawn art too. The new enemy designs are all quite nice in a ghastly sort of way, though I did think the Cadaver faction in the Tangle was a little too clearly evoking the undead from the first game. The inimitable Wayne June is on narration duty again, but I have mixed feelings about that. He's actually playing a new character, the Academic, but he's using the exact same voice and speaking style as the ancestor from the original.
Ruin has come to our family.
Ruin has found you at last.
I can empathize with Red Hook here. On the one hand, they wanted to tell a new story, but on the other, the Ancestors narration was truly iconic, an essential part of Darkest Dungeon's identity, and I'm convinced the game would not have done as well without it. It seems like they landed on a sort of awkward middle ground here, having the same voice in the same role, but as a different character. There are actually some substantive differences between the two. Without getting into spoilers, the academic plays a different role in the narrative and is a little bit more positive and idealistic personality-wise, but that just makes the identical voice all the more jarring. I'm not trying to go after Wayne June here. That dude could read the phone book and make it enrapturing, but I do think it might have been better to go all in or not at all. Either cast someone new to play the new character, or just use the ancestor again, logic be damned. The narrative itself has been changed up too. There's a more abstract, symbolic, psychological horror vibe to the story, and Darkest Dungeon vets might be surprised by how positive the game's message is. Don't get me wrong, it's still a grim story about an apocalypse, but there's a lot of thematic stuff about overcoming your own failures and growing as a person. Or, as the academic puts it, we need not be defined by our shortcomings. I wasn't really a fan of where it went in the end personally, but that's more of a subjective thing and I don't want to get into spoilers. There's still basically zero world building, but that's clearly not what Red Hook are interested in as storytellers. The new bosses also don't really get any real explanation or backstory, which is a shame because I really enjoyed those sections of the first game. The other big narrative change is a much heavier focus on the heroes as individual characters, which is mechanically reinforced by them all now coming with default canon names and being limited to one character per party. Where before a hero's personality was only hinted at by bits of dialogue, now they've all got fully fleshed out backstories. One of the location types you can encounter are hero shrines, and every time you visit one, you can see a piece of one of your hero's uniformly bleak, tragic histories. A lot of it's just narration, but a few times you get to reenact a sequence from their past life, and these bits are probably the most interesting part of the game from a narrative gameplay perspective. What makes them unusual is that they still use the format of a turn-based 4-rank combat, but apply it to situations beyond conventional fighting. For example, the Plague Doctor's first memory has her debating her university professor using moves like study notes and rebuttal. Watching the devs fit these story moments into a gameplay structure that wasn't built for them is really neat, and it's always nice to see a marriage of gameplay and story like this. I'm sure there was a temptation to just leave the whole thing to narration, but I'm glad they took the time to include these little vignettes. I always liked the little character origin comics from way back in the original, and seeing them brought to life and expanded on was a real treat, though it also did make me feel all the more resentful that some of my old favorites were left out. I originally said at the start that I wanted to gather my feelings about this game, and honestly, 8 pages later, I'm not sure I succeeded, but I think on the whole, I'd land on Darkest Dungeon 2 not being quite the full sum of its parts. Oh, I liked it. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely recommend it, and I'm still getting the itch to go back and play some more long after having beaten it, but it just didn't absorb me the same way the original bet did back in 2016. There's a lot to like here. The presentation is still fantastic, the combat is on the whole more varied and balanced, and the enhanced narrative focus via the hero shrines is a great addition. For all that though, there's a lot of annoyances too. The loss of heroes sucks, the relationship system is a step down from the affliction system, and Darkest Dungeon's mechanics don't really gel that well with a pure roguelike. Spending hours on a run just to watch it go up in smoke on the back of a couple bad dice rolls feels frustrating, not fun. As underdeveloped as the Hamlet management stuff was, I think it would have been better to flesh it out and improve it rather than cut it out entirely. I understand what they were going for, and I get not wanting to just do a repeat of the first game, but for me personally, this journey never quite reached the destination.